The morning of August 7th, 1945, arrived at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, with the kind of stillness that precedes revelation. 200 Japanese prisoners of war sat in rows within a converted barn, their faces masks of careful neutrality, their postures rigid with the discipline that had been beaten into them since childhood. They had been summoned for an announcement, and in the 18 months since their capture, they had learned that announcements from American officers rarely brought comfort. Captain Henry Gericke stood at the front of the assembly, a small, round-faced chaplain whose Lutheran collar seemed incongruous against the backdrop of barbed wire and armed guards visible through the barn's high windows. In his hand, he held a single sheet of paper, still warm from the teletype machine. The words on it described something that had happened the day before, something so unprecedented that even now, military censors were debating whether prisoners should be told at all. Gericke had argued they must know, not because of military protocol or strategic advantage, but because he believed in a truth more fundamental than victory or defeat. These men, he had insisted to his commanding officer, were human beings who deserved to understand that the world had changed forever. Behind him, the paper trembled slightly in his hand, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was about to reveal. The prisoners waited. Among them sat Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto, a former pilot shot down over the Gilbert Islands, his right arm still stiff from wounds that had never properly healed in the shark-infested waters where he'd floated for 3 days before rescue. Beside him, Sergeant Kenji Ito, an infantryman captured on Saipan, his face bearing the scar of a flamethrower that had nearly claimed him. In the back row, Private Hiroshi Nakamura, barely 20 years old, who had surrendered on Okinawa only after watching his entire unit immolate themselves in a cave rather than face the dishonor of captivity. Each man carried shame like a second skin. They had violated the most sacred principle of the Imperial Japanese military. They had allowed themselves to be taken alive. The instruction had been clear since basic training: death before dishonor. The Emperor's subjects do not surrender. A true Japanese dies rather than submits to captivity. Yet here they sat, breathing, eating American rations, sleeping in American barracks, existing in a state their culture had no name for because it was supposed to be impossible. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Captain Gericke cleared his throat, and the sound cut through the barn like a knife. He began to speak, his Japanese halting but sincere, learned through months of evening study with a dictionary and grammar books checked out from the base library. He was not a natural linguist, and the prisoners could hear his Midwestern accent mangling their language's subtle tones. But they listened because something in his bearing commanded attention. "Yesterday," he said, choosing each word carefully, "something happened in your homeland, something that has never happened before in human history." The prisoners stirred, barely perceptible shifts in posture, the unconscious tensing of men bracing for another blow. They had learned to expect bad news. Letters from home had stopped arriving months ago, censored into non-existence, or lost in a mail system that no longer functioned. The fragments of news that reached them through whispered conversations with guards spoke of firebombing, of cities turned to ash, of a homeland shrinking beneath waves of B-29s. A city called Hiroshima, Gericke continued, was struck by a single bomb dropped from a single aircraft. This bomb was unlike any weapon ever created. It harnessed the fundamental power of the atom, itself. He paused, searching for words that could convey the incomprehensible. In an instant, the center of the city ceased to exist. Buildings, homes, people, everything within miles, gone in a flash, brighter than the sun. The silence that followed was absolute, not the silence of understanding, but of incomprehension so complete that response became impossible. Lieutenant Yamamoto felt his breath stop in his chest. A single bomb? The entire center of a city? It made no tactical sense, no strategic sense, no sense at all. He had flown bombing missions over Chinese cities, knew intimately the mathematics of destruction, dozens of aircraft carrying hundreds of bombs to destroy a few city blocks. The chaplain's words described something that violated every principle of warfare he understood. Sergeant Ito's scar began to throb, a phantom pain that always emerged when stress overwhelmed him. He thought of his wife in Osaka, his 2 daughters, his elderly parents. Were they safe? Was Osaka next? The question bloomed in his mind with terrible clarity. If the Americans could destroy an entire city with one bomb, they could destroy every city. There would be nothing left of Japan but radioactive ash. In the back row, Private Nakamura felt something crack inside him. He had surrendered, believing he had committed the ultimate betrayal, that his family would never forgive him, that his name would be stricken from the family register as though he had never existed. But if what the chaplain said was true, if weapons now existed that could erase entire cities in seconds, then perhaps everything he had been taught about honor and sacrifice was as obsolete as the samurai swords his grandfather had shown him as a child. Gerika watched their faces, seeing the shock ripple through the assembled prisoners like a stone dropped into still water. He had prepared for anger, for disbelief, perhaps even for violence born of desperation. What he saw instead was something more profound and more disturbing. The prisoners sat frozen, their eyes wide but unseeing, as though they were looking not at him but through him into some void that had suddenly opened in their understanding of reality. "The weapon is called an atomic bomb," he continued, his voice softening. "Your scientists know of this possibility. Some of your leaders will claim it is propaganda, that such a weapon cannot exist. But I tell you truthfully, it does exist, and it has been used." The words hung in the air, heavy with implications. None of them were ready to process. For these men, the news represented not just a military defeat, but a philosophical catastrophe. They had been raised in a culture that taught them Japanese spirit could overcome any material disadvantage. The divine wind, the kamikaze that had saved Japan from Mongol invasion centuries before, was not just history, but prophecy. Superior spiritual strength, willingness to sacrifice everything, would inevitably triumph over enemy wealth and technology. The atomic bomb rendered that entire worldview meaningless. There was no spirit strong enough to withstand instant vaporization. No amount of willingness to die mattered when death came faster than thought itself. The weapon did not just destroy cities. It destroyed the logic that had sustained Japanese resistance through years of mounting losses. Lieutenant Yamamoto found his voice first, though it came out as a whisper barely audible beyond the first row. "How many died?" Gerika looked down at his paper, though he had already memorized the figures. "The reports are incomplete. Initial estimates suggest tens of thousands, perhaps more. The bomb's effects are still being assessed. Tens of thousands. In an instant, Yamamoto had seen death in war, had dealt it himself from his cockpit, watching bombs tumble toward targets below. But death in war had rhythm, sequence, cause and effect, separated by seconds, that allowed the mind to process what was happening. This was different. This was erasure, the instantaneous transformation of human beings into shadows and ash. Around the barn, prisoners began to react, though their reactions varied wildly. Some wept openly, tears streaming down faces they made no effort to hide. Others sat rigid, refusing to acknowledge the information, as though denial could unmake reality. A few began to mutter prayers to ancestors, to the emperor, to any force that might offer explanation or comfort. Sergeant Ito felt his hands begin to shake. He pressed them flat against his thighs, willing them to stillness, but the trembling spread through his body like electricity. His wife's last letter, received 8 months ago, had described taking their daughters to visit relatives in the countryside, trying to escape the bombing of Osaka. Had they gone west? Was Hiroshima where they had fled to? The question consumed him, but there was no way to know, no way to find out, trapped here behind American wire while his homeland burned, with atomic fire. Captain Gerika set down his paper and stepped forward, closer to the prisoners than protocol usually permitted. The guards at the barn's entrance tensed, hands moving unconsciously toward their weapons, but Gerika paid them no attention. He had argued strenuously against having armed guards present during this announcement, believing their presence would transform disclosure into intimidation. He had lost that argument, but he could at least close the physical distance between himself and the men he was addressing. "I know," he said, and his voice carried a weight of empathy that surprised even himself, "that this news is impossible to comprehend. I know that everything you believed about this war, about your nation's strength, about the path to victory, has been challenged by what I have just told you." He paused, letting the words settle. Around the barn, the morning light had strengthened, slanting through the high windows in beams thick with dust motes. The effect was almost ethereal, as though they all existed in some liminal space between worlds, between the reality they had known and whatever terrible new reality was being born. "What I tell you next," Gericke continued, "is more important than military information or strategic assessment. You are prisoners, yes. Your nation and mine are at war, but you are also human beings, souls in torment, men who have lost everything familiar and now face news that your homeland suffers in ways you cannot protect against." Lieutenant Yamamoto felt something shift in his chest, a tightness he had carried since the moment of his capture beginning to loosen. The chaplain was not gloating, not using this news as a weapon to break their spirits further. There was genuine pain in his voice, as though the suffering of strangers on the other side of the world genuinely wounded him. "In my faith," Gericke said, "we believe that every human life has value, that every soul matters to God regardless of the provened, uniform it wears, or the nation it serves. I cannot undo what has been done to Hiroshima. I cannot stop what may yet come, but I can tell you that you are not forgotten, that your suffering is not invisible, and that in this place, in this moment, you will be treated not as enemies but as human beings deserving of dignity and compassion." The words were simple, almost plain, but they landed among the prisoners with unexpected force. They had been trained to expect cruelty from captors, taught that Americans would torture them, that surrender meant degradation and death. Instead, they had found themselves in barracks with running water, given medical care for their wounds, fed rations that, while monotonous, were adequate. And now this chaplain, this enemy officer, was speaking to them of dignity and compassion in the aftermath of their nation's worst catastrophe. Private Nakamura felt tears streaming down his face and made no effort to stop them. He had been numb for months, existing in a kind of psychological suspension where feeling anything seemed too dangerous. But the chaplain's words had pierced that numbness, and suddenly he was sobbing, his shoulders shaking, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Around him, other prisoners began to break as well, the dam of stoicism cracking as grief overwhelmed discipline. What Captain Gericke did next would be remembered by every man in that barn for the rest of their lives. He did not retreat to his position of authority at the front of the room. He did not summon guards to restore order. Instead, he moved among the prisoners, placing his hand on shoulders, murmuring words of comfort in his halting Japanese, allowing men he was supposed to consider enemies to weep against his chest. The guards watched with expressions ranging from confusion to discomfort. They had been trained to maintain distance, to see prisoners as potential threats requiring constant vigilance, but their chaplain was embracing these men, treating them not as enemies but as bereaved human beings. One young guard, barely 19, felt his own throat tighten as he watched grown men collapse into grief that could no longer be contained. Sergeant Ito found himself speaking, though he had not planned to, had not even realized words were forming. "My family," he said in broken English, then switched to Japanese, hoping the chaplain would understand. "My wife took our daughters west to escape the bombing. I do not know where they went. I do not know if they are alive." Gericke knelt beside him, his knees protesting the hard wooden floor, his hand steady on Ito's shoulder. "I cannot promise you they are safe," he said quietly. "I will not lie to you with false comfort. But I can promise you that we will try to find out. I will write to the Red Cross, to the authorities who track displaced persons. If there is information to be found, we will find it." The promise was simple, perhaps even futile given the chaos that surely gripped Japan. But to Ito, it was everything. For the first time since his capture, an American was treating his anguish as legitimate, his family as real people rather than abstract enemies. He nodded, unable to speak, his hand reaching up to grip the chaplain's arm with desperate gratitude. Lieutenant Yamamoto remained seated, his face carved from stone, but his mind raced with calculations. If the Americans had one atomic bomb, they had more. The resources required to develop such a weapon were staggering, but clearly not impossible, which meant every major city in Japan was now a potential target. Tokyo, Osaka, Kyoto, Nagasaki, all could be erased as easily as Hiroshima. The war was not just lost, it was over. Japan simply had not admitted it yet. The realization brought not relief, but a profound sense of betrayal. He thought of the pilots he had trained with, men who had volunteered for kamikaze missions, who had flown their planes into American ships, believing their sacrifice would turn the tide of war. They had died for nothing. The tide had already turned, rendered irreversible not by their lack of courage, but by a weapon that made courage meaningless. As the morning wore on, the prisoners began to fragment into groups, each processing the news differently. Some gathered in corners, speaking in urgent whispers, debating whether the chaplain's report could be trusted. Others sat alone, staring at nothing, lost in private calculations of what this meant for families and futures. A few approached Gareka directly, asking questions he often could not answer, seeking details that did not yet exist. Private Nakamura found himself drawn to the chaplain despite his instincts. Everything in his training screamed that this was a trick, a psychological operation designed to break their will. Yet there was something in Gareka's bearing that defied that interpretation. The man seemed genuinely distressed by what he was reporting, as though the suffering of Japanese civilians wounded him personally. "Why do you care?" Nakamura asked in halting English, the words awkward on his tongue. "We are your enemy. Our people killed your people. Why do you cry for us?" Gareka looked at the young private, seeing past the uniform to the boy beneath, hardly older than his own son serving somewhere in Europe. "Because," he said slowly, "the moment we stop seeing our enemies as human beings, we become the very evil we claim to fight. Your nation did terrible things in this war. My nation has now done something terrible as well. But you, standing here before me, you are not those crimes. You are a young man far from home, grieving for people you love. That is something I understand, regardless of the flag we serve." The answer was so unexpected, so fundamentally at odds with everything Nakamura had been taught about American barbarism, that he felt his worldview tilt dangerously. If the enemy could be compassionate, if they could grieve for Japanese suffering, then what did that say about everything else he had believed? What did it say about the propaganda that had painted Americans as demons? What did it say about the honor he had betrayed by choosing life over death? As noon approached, Gareka made an announcement that sent ripples of shock through the assembled prisoners. "This afternoon," he said, "I will hold a service of remembrance for the victims of Hiroshima. All are welcome to attend, regardless of your faith. We will pray for the dead, for the survivors, for your families, and for an end to this war that has caused such suffering." The invitation was unprecedented, a Christian chaplain offering to pray for Japanese war dead, for the victims of an American weapon, in the presence of Japanese prisoners of war. Some of the guards looked scandalized, one even stepping forward as if to object before thinking better of it. But Gareka's face was set with determination, his eyes carrying a steel that suggested this was not open for debate. Lieutenant Yamamoto felt something he had not experienced in the year and a half since his capture, a flicker of hope. Not hope that Japan would win. That ship had sailed the moment Fat Man fell on Hiroshima. But hope that perhaps there was a future beyond this war, a world where former enemies could acknowledge each other's humanity, where grief could be shared rather than weaponized. That afternoon, when the prisoners gathered in the camp's small chapel, a converted storage building with rough wooden benches and a simple cross at the front, nearly all 200 attended. They filed in silently, their faces still marked by shock, their movements carrying the careful dignity of men who had decided that whatever else they had lost, they would not surrender their humanity. Gereka stood at the front, and beside him, to everyone's surprise, stood Lieutenant Yamamoto. The pilot had approached the chaplain during lunch, requesting permission to speak at the service. Gereka had agreed, without hesitation, understanding that these men needed to voice their grief in their own words, their own language, their own way. The service began with Gereka reading from the Book of Psalms, his voice steady as he recited words written millennia ago by people who had also known war, loss, and the feeling that God had abandoned them. How long, O Lord? Will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts, and day after day have sorrow in my heart? The words, translated into Japanese by a prisoner who had studied English before the war, resonated through the chapel. These ancient cries of anguish spoke to their modern suffering, bridging cultures and centuries with the universal language of grief. Then, Yamamoto stepped forward. His voice, when he began to speak, was rough with emotion but determined. "We gather here, not as soldiers," he said in Japanese, "but as men who mourn. We mourn the innocent who perished in Hiroshima. We mourn the families we cannot reach, the homeland we cannot protect. We mourn the future that was stolen from us and from those who died." He paused, his hands gripping the simple wooden podium that Gereka had fashioned from scrap lumber. "I flew bombing missions over China," he continued, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. "I killed people whose names I will never know, whose faces I never saw. I told myself it was necessary, that war demanded such things. Perhaps it did, but those people died all the same, and their families mourned them all the same." Around the chapel, prisoners shifted uncomfortably. This was not the kind of speech they expected from a former officer, this acknowledgement of their own complicity in suffering. But Yamamoto pressed on, driven by a need to articulate something that had been building in him since the moment he heard about Hiroshima. "The bomb that fell on Hiroshima killed in seconds what would have taken my squadron months to accomplish. That make it worse? I do not know. The dead are equally dead whether they die slowly or instantly. But I know this. We are all guilty. Japan is guilty for the war it started, for the atrocities it committed. America is guilty for the weapon it unleashed. And we, sitting here in safety while our people suffer, we carry our own guilt for surviving when so many did not." The confession hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. Sergeant Ito felt it resonate in his chest, this articulation of the shame that had gnawed at him since Saipan. He had surrendered not because he was a coward, but because the battle was already lost, his unit decimated, his weapon destroyed. Yet the shame had been constant, a weight that pressed on him with every breath. "But perhaps," Yamamoto continued, his voice strengthening, "there is a path forward. This chaplain has shown us something I did not expect to find in captivity: compassion. He mourns for our people, even though we are his enemies. He sees our suffering even though we caused suffering ourselves. If a man who has every reason to hate us can still treat us with dignity, then perhaps there is hope that when this war ends, we can rebuild something better than what we destroyed." If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Gerek felt tears streaming down his own face as he listened to Yamamoto's words translated by another prisoner. This was why he had become a chaplain, this moment of human connection that transcended the machinery of war. He had spent years ministering to soldiers, offering comfort to the dying, writing letters to families of the fallen. But this felt different, more profound. Here was a former enemy officer, a man trained to hate Americans, speaking of hope and reconciliation in the ashes of his nation's greatest catastrophe. When Yamamoto finished, the chapel was silent, except for the sound of weeping. Men who had maintained rigid composure through interrogations and isolation now let their grief pour out freely. They wept for Hiroshima, for families they could not reach, for comrades dead on distant battlefields, for the Japan they had known that would never exist again. Gereki led them in prayer, his voice breaking as he asked God to comfort the afflicted, to bring peace to the suffering, to guide humanity away from the brink of nuclear annihilation. He prayed in English and Japanese, mixing languages as freely as the grief that bound them all, until the words themselves became less important than the act of voicing anguish to whatever power might be listening. As the service ended and prisoners began to file out, many stopped to speak with Gereki, to clasp his hand, to express gratitude in broken English or eloquent Japanese. Private Nakamura, his eyes still red from crying, bowed deeply to the chaplain, a gesture of respect he had not offered to anyone since his capture. "You have given us something I did not expect to find here," Nakamura said quietly. "You have given us permission to grieve. In Japan, we are taught that to show weakness is shameful, that suffering must be endured in silence. But you have shown us that grief is not weakness, it is human, and you have reminded us that we are still human, despite everything." Gereki embraced the young soldier, feeling the boy's thin frame shake with residual sobs. "You were never anything less than human," he whispered. "War tried to make you forget that, but your humanity was always there, waiting to be acknowledged." The days that followed saw a transformation in Camp McCoy that no one could have predicted. The news of Hiroshima had shattered something in the prisoners, but rather than breaking them, it had opened a space for something new to grow. The rigid hierarchies that had governed their interactions began to soften. Officers and enlisted men spoke more freely with each other, united by shared grief rather than divided by rank. More surprisingly, the barriers between prisoners and guards began to erode. Guards who had maintained cold professionalism found themselves responding to prisoners as individuals rather than abstractions. One guard, learning that a prisoner's brother had been stationed in Hiroshima, spent his own money to send a Red Cross inquiry on the man's behalf. Another began teaching English to a group of younger prisoners who wanted to prepare for whatever future awaited them after the war. Captain Gereki became a fixture in the prisoner barracks, visiting daily, always available to listen, to counsel, to simply sit in silence with men who needed presence more than words. He conducted weekly services that became increasingly well attended, not because the prisoners converted to Christianity, but because the chapel had become a space where grief was honored rather than suppressed, where questions of meaning and purpose could be explored without shame. Lieutenant Yamamoto found himself becoming an informal leader among the prisoners, not through military rank, but through moral authority. His willingness to acknowledge Japanese war crimes, to grapple with the complexity of their situation, gave others permission to do the same. Slowly, painfully, the prisoners began to construct a new understanding of themselves, one that acknowledged their guilt while also affirming their humanity. Sergeant Ito received word through the Red Cross 3 weeks after the Hiroshima announcement. His wife and daughters were alive, living with relatives in a village north of Osaka. The message was brief, just a few lines confirming their survival and location, but to Ito it was salvation. He wept openly when Gereki delivered the news, his body shaking with relief so intense it felt almost like pain. "They live," he whispered over and over. "They live." Gereki sat with him as he processed the news, understanding that relief and guilt were intertwined in the sergeant's heart. His family had survived, but thousands of other families had not. His children would grow up, but the children of Hiroshima had been vaporized in an instant. The randomness of survival felt almost cruel in its arbitrariness. "Why them?" Ito asked finally, his voice hoarse. "Why did my family survive when so many others died? What did we do to deserve such mercy?" Gereki had no answer that could satisfy that question. He had asked it himself countless times, ministering to dying soldiers who wondered why their friends lived while they perished. "Grace," he said finally, "is not about deserving. It simply is. Your family survived not because they earned it, but because of chance, timing, location, 1,000 factors beyond anyone's control. The question is not why they survived, but what you will do with the gift of their survival." The words provided no comfort, but they offered a framework, a way to transform survivors' guilt into purpose. "Ito," nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. He would live for them, for his wife and daughters who waited for him across an ocean. He would carry the memory of those who died, but he would not let their deaths paralyze him with guilt. On August 9, 1945, news reached Camp McCoy of a second atomic bomb, this one dropped on Nagasaki. The prisoners received the information in stunned silence, the shock somehow even greater than before. One bomb had been incomprehensible. Two suggested an arsenal, a capability to erase Japan city by city until nothing remained but radioactive craters. Gereka watched the prisoners carefully, fearing this second blow might shatter the fragile progress they had made. Instead, he saw something unexpected: resolve. The prisoners gathered in small groups, speaking quietly but with intensity. When Lieutenant Yamamoto approached him that evening, the pilot's face was set with determination. "The war is over," Yamamoto said flatly. "Japan cannot survive this. We will surrender. Perhaps within days. When that happens, we will need to help our people understand what has happened, why surrender was necessary, how to live in a defeated nation." Understanding the weight of what Yamamoto was proposing, these prisoners, once sources of shame, might become bridges between the old Japan and whatever new nation emerged from the ashes. They had experienced American captivity, had learned that surrender did not mean torture and death, had discovered that their enemies could be compassionate. That knowledge would be invaluable in the chaos that would follow Japan's surrender. "You will face resistance," Gereka warned. "Many in Japan will see surrender as betrayal, as the ultimate dishonor. They will not want to hear from former prisoners that Americans can be humane." "Then we must speak louder," Yamamoto replied. "We must tell our truth even if it contradicts the lies we were told. Too many have died for those lies. No more." On August 15th, the Emperor's surrender broadcast reached Camp McCoy through radio intercepts. The prisoners gathered to listen, straining to hear Hirohito's high, thin voice speaking in formal court Japanese that many could barely understand. But the meaning was clear enough. Japan had accepted the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. The war was over. The silence that followed was absolute. No cheers, no celebrations, no visible reactions at all. The prisoners simply sat, processing the reality that their nation had surrendered unconditionally, that the empire they had served no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Everything they had fought for, everything their comrades had died for, had ended in complete defeat. Yet, in that silence, Gereka heard something unexpected: relief. These men had been carrying impossible weight: the shame of survival, the fear for their families, the knowledge that their nation was being destroyed piece by piece. Now that weight had lifted, not because their suffering had ended, but because the uncertainty had resolved itself. They knew now what came next, could begin to imagine a future beyond barbed wire and war. Private Nakamura stood slowly, his young face aged beyond its years by what he had experienced. "May I speak?" he asked quietly, and Yamamoto nodded. "We have lost everything," Nakamura began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Our empire, our honor, our belief that Japanese spirit could overcome any obstacle. We have learned that everything we were taught was either incomplete or false, but we have gained something as well. We have learned that we can survive defeat. We have learned that our enemies can show mercy. We have learned that life continues even when certainty dies." He turned to face Gereka, who stood at the back of the assembly. This chaplain showed us something that Japan forgot: that compassion is not weakness, that acknowledging suffering is not surrender, that treating your enemy as human does not make you a traitor. When we return home, we will carry that lesson with us. We will rebuild Japan, not on the foundation of divine right and military supremacy, but on the foundation of shared humanity that Chaplain Gereka demonstrated. The words were presumptuous, almost arrogant in their assumption that these prisoners could influence Japan's future. Yet they resonated through the assembly with prophetic force. These men, marked by shame and suffering, would indeed return home to help build a new Japan, one that rejected militarism in favor of peace, that embraced democracy instead of divine emperors, that sought reconciliation rather than revenge. Gereka felt his throat tighten as he listened. He had not set out to change Japanese society or to plant seeds of transformation. He had simply tried to treat suffering human beings with the dignity their creator intended, to honor grief regardless of whose side shed the tears, to demonstrate that faith demanded compassion even toward enemies. Yet in doing so, he had accomplished something military weapons could never achieve. He had shown these prisoners that Americans were not the demons their propaganda had depicted, that defeat did not have to mean degradation, that a new path forward was possible if they had the courage to take it. The weeks that followed Japan's surrender were chaotic, filled with bureaucratic confusion, as authorities struggled to process the repatriation of prisoners. But at Camp McCoy, an unusual pattern emerged. Prisoners requested permission to stay longer, to continue the conversations and study groups that had formed, to prepare themselves for return to a homeland they no longer recognized. Gereka found himself teaching not just theology but practical skills: English language, democratic principles, conflict resolution, the basics of rebuilding communities shattered by war. The camp became less a prison and more a school, with prisoners eager to learn everything they could about the nation that had defeated them, hoping to understand the sources of American strength that went beyond atomic bombs. Lieutenant Yamamoto organized discussion groups where prisoners debated Japan's future, grappling with questions that would confront their entire nation. How could they honor the war dead while acknowledging the war had been wrong? How could they maintain Japanese cultural identity while rejecting the militaristic ideology that had led them to ruin? How could they reconcile loyalty to the emperor with the reality that his divinity had been revealed as fiction? These were not academic questions, but existential challenges that would shape the rest of their lives. Gereka sat in on many of these discussions, offering perspective when asked but mostly listening, understanding that these men needed to find their own answers rather than having Western solutions imposed upon them. Sergeant Ito spent his final weeks at Camp McCoy writing letters, dozens of them addressed to his wife, his daughters, his parents, his former commanding officers. In them, he attempted to explain what he had experienced, what he had learned, how his understanding of honor and duty had been transformed. He wrote of Gereka's compassion, of Yamamoto's courage in acknowledging difficult truths, of the strange community that had formed among prisoners united by shared grief and hope. "When I return home," he wrote to his wife, "I will not be the man who left. War has changed me, but captivity has changed me more. I have learned that our enemies are human, that defeat can lead to wisdom, that the greatest courage is not dying for a cause but living to build something better. I do not know what Japan will become, but I pray we have the wisdom to learn from our mistakes and the courage to build a nation worthy of the sacrifices made." When the prisoners finally boarded ships for repatriation in late 1945, Captain Gereka stood at the dock watching them depart. Lieutenant Yamamoto was among the last to board, and before climbing the gangplank, he turned back to grasp the chaplain's hand one final time. "You changed everything," he said simply. "When we heard about Hiroshima, we believed we had lost everything, our nation, our honor, our future. But you showed us that humanity survives even atomic fire, that compassion is stronger than any weapon, that the end of one world can be the beginning of another." Gereka nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging his throat. He watched as 200 men who had entered Camp McCoy as defeated enemies departed as something else entirely, ambassadors of reconciliation carrying the seeds of a transformed Japan. The prisoners scattered across their shattered homeland, but they carried with them the lessons learned behind American barbed wire. Sergeant Ito returned to Osaka and became a teacher, dedicating his life to educating young Japanese about the true cost of militarism and the value of peace. Private Nakamura worked with occupation authorities, serving as a translator and cultural bridge, helping Americans understand Japanese society while helping his countrymen accept their new reality. Lieutenant Yamamoto became an advocate for reconciliation, speaking publicly about his experiences, arguing that Japan's future lay not in resentment, but in learning from those who had defeated them. They were not alone. The 200 prisoners of Camp McCoy became part of a generation that rebuilt Japan from atomic ashes, creating a nation that rejected war, embraced democracy, and proved that defeat could be transformed into wisdom if accompanied by the courage to acknowledge hard truths and the willingness to accept mercy from unexpected sources. Decades later, when historians examined Japan's remarkable post-war transformation, they focused on Douglas MacArthur's reforms, American aid, the new constitution, and economic policies. Few noticed the quieter influence of Coptor, men like those who had passed through Camp McCoy, prisoners who had learned from a Lutheran chaplain that compassion transcends nationality, that grief deserves honor regardless of whose tears fall, and that the most powerful weapon against hatred is not a bomb that destroys cities, but a hand extended in genuine human kindness. Captain Henry Gericke never sought recognition for what he had done. He simply returned to his congregation in Street Louis after the war, resuming his quiet ministry, carrying in his heart the memory of 200 men who had arrived broken by news of Hiroshima and departed, carrying hope that humanity could survive even its own worst impulses. The atomic bomb had ended the war in fire and ash, but it was mercy, offered freely in a prison camp in Wisconsin, that had shown those prisoners a path toward peace that would outlast any weapon ever devised. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.